Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Content Maker stage. For people that tell stories is the tagline that goes with this particular stage that you'll see on the app. Makes it sound slightly like we're not telling the truth, but I can assure you that is not the case. I can promise you this morning a fantastic morning of insights and great truths about the content making world. So I'm Jim Pryor. I am the global CEO of Superunion, a brand agency. My great pleasure to be MC here this morning and guide you through a fantastic array of speakers. And look, we're all in the right place this morning, I think, on the content maker stage, as Bill Gates wrote in his seminal essay on the soon-to-be, as it were, power of the internet back in 1996. Content is king. But I think it's fair to say, in many ways, that the content landscape we live in now is considerably more complicated than it was back in those days of 1996 when Bill Gates first wrote those words. Today, I think it's fair to say the competition for ascendancy in the content world has become incredibly complex. You might say almost as complicated as the monarchy in Game of Thrones. It's an incredibly competitive and difficult landscape in which we're all working. And here's just an example from my own personal content experience over the last week. So I'm enjoying watching Succession at the moment. Great show, recommend it to everybody. Succession is an HBO show, but I'm not watching it on HBO. I'm watching it on Prime Video, or Amazon Prime Video. Not quite clear whether Amazon are calling it Prime or Amazon Prime Video right now, but that's what I'm watching it on. I could equally, of course, have watched it on Sky Atlantic. At the same time, my son is watching The Big Bang Theory, which is a CBS show, although he's not watching it on CBS, he's watching it on Netflix. But he's watching it through his PS4 for reasons that I'm not entirely sure I will ever fully understand. But he's also watching it at the same time in a different sequence on E4, the terrestrial channel in the UK. Then at the weekend, I was away, but I wanted to watch the Rugby World Cup final. That might not mean a lot to all of you, but for any South Africans here now, well played. But I was in a house that had no analog aerial signal on it. So while it was broadcast live on ITV, I couldn't watch it directly through that. I had to log into my ITV Hub account through a Now TV stick that was plugged into somebody else's Samsung TV. I can tell you, logging into somebody else's TV in another house feels a little bit like you've robbed their cupboards. It's an emotional guilt trip in its own right. And all of this content journey is before we start to layer in the new and promised launches of services from other people. And just a note on that Samsung TV. The Samsung TV is a content brand experience of its own right. Not only does the TV find it necessary to brand itself as smart, I mean, who wants a stupid TV? But it includes this vast array of apps that spin across the bottom of the stage that I doubt anyone's ever going to click on. And as I say, we're also at the same time promised new services from Apple, from Disney, from HBO, and goodness knows what else is in the pipeline there. So for me, this is just a week in my life of the kind of brands that I'm encountering and coming across in my content experience. And for a world in which the content is supposed to be king, that is actually a really confusing landscape of people competing for time and competing for money. And I'm using TV as an example here, but I think the same could certainly be said about all forms of content. As the facility to produce and distribute content has grown, so demand has increased and competition has intensified. And this complexity and confusion doesn't only live in the minds of the viewer. The content makers themselves are finding this a really discombobulating time in which to do business and to operate. Content makers are fighting not just for audiences, but they're fighting for content makers, for producers, for writers, for directors, for talent, for developers to come, and marketing people to come and work for them and be part of their setup and not go somewhere else. They're also negotiating some pretty complicated business deals, at times going into partnerships and co-ventures with people who one day are their partner and the following day are perhaps their fiercest competitor. They're also having to adapt to a constant influx of new technologies, of disruption happening on a daily basis, to which they've got to adopt or adapt, and they have to adopt it, else they're going to be left behind. And at the same time, they have to wrestle with the challenges of regulation and policy, that many of which, as they deal with governments, institutions, and other regulatory bodies, the policies were very often written in a naive, pre-internet, pre-global world, and somehow they have to make sense of all of that. And let's remember that the content-making world we're talking about is, by any reasonable measure, a $1 trillion industry. So the numbers here are huge. The money that has to be raised by these makers, whether that's through private or public investment or other means, through advertising, through sponsorships, is absolutely huge. So it's a huge industry. And by the way, all you content makers out there, you are fundamental to how we shape society, to the things that we consider to be the norms of behavior in our world today. Without the content makers, the world as we know it might collapse. So it's a huge and challenging arena. Being a content maker now is about much, much more than just making great content. In fact, I'd say content makers face probably the biggest and most significant set of brand challenges of any industry in any sector today. The good news for content makers is that they're really good at brand building. It's a particular forte, I think, of that sector. Content makers have always been amazingly good at understanding audiences, knowing what they want and what they're going to want next, and responding to that in fast and real time. They've always been good at managing complexity, at adapting to new technologies and moving forward. And even in visual brand building terms, content makers have been expert at that for many years. While other designers were worrying about the kerning on a letterhead in a piece of print, the broadcast and content world was embracing sonic identities, motion graphics, and a really wide concept of identity that stretched well beyond logos. And most fundamentally for me, at the heart of all great content sits brilliant creativity and brilliant ideas, just as it has to be and is for all the world's truly greatest brands. So content makers ought to be really well placed to create great brands, but I don't think all of them can succeed in that task, because the complexity in the content world is huge, and I don't think it's sustainable. Audiences cannot possibly live with all of those choices. They're not going to subscribe to everything that's out there. Neither do they have the intellectual capacity, let alone the financial capacity to do that. So for content brands, the challenge is not only to build strong brands, but to build brands that will beat their competitors, brands that will prove to be the stronger brands in the marketplace, that will survive takeovers, that will be the dominant brand in mergers, that can emerge better, stronger than their competitors. So it's a huge challenge. There are far more of them out there right now than can possibly all survive. So no doubt our fantastic lineup of speakers this morning are going to cover these topics, and I'm sure many more. We've got gaming giant Axiomatic, we've got commercial news channel Euronews, we've got UK broadcaster BBC Two, and many, many other great guests coming on this morning. And remember, we want all of you to get involved. So if you want to ask a question, you can go to your app, go to the Slido function, and submit your questions through there. I would love to hear points of view from you, and please do choose to get involved. So let's move now quickly on to our first talk this morning. We're going to hear from Google's global head of product policy and content moderation about the policies that govern the types of content that can be shared or hosted on Google's many platforms. I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating talk, and there'll be a wealth of information in here, no doubt, for content creators, advertisers, publishers, developers, everyone, in fact. So please welcome to the stage, in conversation with Jonathan Weber from Reuters, the global head of product policy and content moderation at Google, David Graff.